My name is George Knapp, your occasional host. Tonight, a status check of sorts. I'm talking about what has become of our country, where we're headed. I have personally kind of always been in the category of one of those glasses half full people, believing that despite our seemingly insurmountable challenges, that we could, as a country, rise up and prevail once again. But I have to tell you, I'm no longer really an optimist. I mean, by no means am I ready to say our goose is cooked, we're toast, but I become less and less hopeful the more I learn about how things really work and who pulls the strings. Every day we're at each other's throats, arguing about every little thing, as well as arguing about big things, yelling at each other, pointing fingers of blame, labeling. I mean, my personal belief is that this sort of plays into the hands of those who really call the shots. They like having us go at each other, divided by political beliefs, by income status, by race or ethnicity, by sex or sexual preference, divided by everything. Divisions that are often exaggerated and exploited by those who are only too happy to sort of skip right past our street fight while they're on their way to the bank. And the guy who will lift up the edge of the tent to let us get a clearer view of the circus act that's underway under the big top is a fellow journalist, an investigative reporter, a courageous guy who's been telling us things we don't necessarily want to hear for a long time. Jim Marrs is my guest. I just finished reading Jim's most recent book, The $1 Trillion Conspiracy, and like all of his books, it's an eye-opener. It casts a very wide net, linking together seemingly unrelated events and unrelated people, but once you recognize the connections and you see this pattern, it's pretty hard to ever see the world the same way again. And I say this not in a derogatory way, but this book, when taken together with the body of Jim Marrs' earlier works, stitches together an incredibly complex web of deceit and treachery that affects all of us, every one of us, every day of our lives. Call it the mother of all conspiracy theories, which I know to some is a put-down, but not here, not on Coast to Coast, and not to Jim's legions of loyal readers. A primary focus of this book is what Mr. Marrs calls zombie bankers and how they're destroying America. This is ground that is somewhat familiar to me as well, having written extensively about the still devastating effects of the latest feeding frenzy by these cocaine-crazed, hooker-addicted, money-grubbing robber barons of Wall Street. Banksters, we call them, not bankers, banksters. But as we learned tonight, the true picture, the view from way up high, is not just that our country and the world have been ravaged again and again by the merely greedy of Wall Street. The picture that Jim Marrs paints is far more insidious, and we're going to cover it to the best of our ability. Jim Marrs, great to have you back on the show.
Hey, George, it's always a pleasure to be with you. It's like the old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times.
Well, we certainly do, I guess. And you've covered some of the most interesting stories of our time. I want to start this way. How much of an issue is it for you as a journalist to be dissed or dismissed because they can write you off as a conspiracy author? Oh, that's just Jim Marrs because he's a conspiracy guy.
Oh, you know what? I've gotten pretty hard-shelled about that because I can look back, and you said I've been in the business for 30 years. Actually, if you'll go back to my high school days when I participated in a junior achievement program, it was actually editing, writing stories and proofing them and for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. As a teen page, so I was actually working on a real newspaper, real big metropolitan newspaper in high school. Then I've been at it actually for about 50 years now. So after 50 years, after half a century, when I look back, I find that even though I've been called a buff and a conspiracy theorist and even a nut, it turns out that everything generally that I have presented has always proved to be true. So, you know, you can call me all the names you want to, but just don't call me late for supper.
You know? Well, I'll tell you, Jim, I feel a certain kinship with you. We're not, close friends or anything. We've known each other a long time, only from afar mostly, but I feel a certain identification with you because a lot of the ground that you've covered is stuff I've covered, though not in the depth of your books, but I really do. I understand a lot of the challenges you must face. As I look over the list of these great books you've written about Nazis and 9/11 and the alien agenda, I just wonder, do you have an editor who over says, why don't you take a look at this stuff in smaller bites? Because a smaller bite would be more credible. When you tie all this stuff together, it's just not believable.
Well, no, but I had an editor who said, I think you really ought to take this whole section out. And this was after the legal review. And I said, well, no, I don't think so. I think it's very important. People need to hear about this, and I have it, fully sourced. And he said, well, let me put it this way. You take this out or I won't publish this book. And the irony of this censorship was the whole section he wanted out was how the corporate mass media censors the news. So I told him, I said, you kind of proved my point, didn't you?
How did that end up?
Well, naturally, I wanted the rest of the information in the book out, so they had me between the rock and the hard place, and it came out. Okay, and folks, this is nothing unusual. This happens every day in every publication, every newsroom, every TV station, every radio station, because it's the old line about freedom of the press belongs to the guy who owns the press. And if they say, well, you can keep your job and we'll cut this out, or you can lose your job, or we won't publish your work, unless you take it out, then unfortunately most of the time you have to take it out. I mean, I'm all for standing up for principle, and I do every chance I get. But, when it's a choice of getting some information out versus none, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to go for some.
Well, there's also, at a basic level, you have to eat, too. You have to have a roof over your head so you can keep working, right?
Absolutely, and that's another thing. Now, that's one of the things that does gripe me, is the people who say, well, you're only writing that stuff just to publish a book and make some money. Well, if they'd have a look at my bank account, they'd realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. I mean, I'm sure, George, you've heard of Rich and Famous, right?
I have heard of it, yeah. I've seen it from afar.
Nobody ever told you about Just Famous, did they?
Well, I mean, are you telling me, Jim Mars, that you're not filthy rich from all these conspiracy books you've written?
You got to be kidding.
Yeah.
Well, let's take Crossfire. I suppose I made some good money off of Crossfire, but then that was stretched out over a 20-year period, and we take all the money that I made from Crossfire and stretch it out over the 20 years. It comes to about $15,000 a year. I don't know many people that are going to work for $15,000 a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about, George.
I do.
It's not all it's cracked up to be. The problem is everybody wants to act like they're doing great. That's the PR thing. Well, doing great. Business is good. I'm selling good, selling lots of good stuff. So nobody ever wants to say, but hey, we're all scrambling. Everybody's scrambling, except for the 1%. Everybody else is just trying to make ends meet just like everybody else. Now, I don't want to be poor boying, and I'm paying my bills, which is a lot better than a lot of people are doing these days. But, no, you don't get rich, especially when you're trying to tell the truth. Crossfire went through 25 publishers back in the 80s, and they said, this is all in New York, most of them, and they said, everything could be said about the Kennedy assassination, been said. Oswald did it all by himself. We know that. And besides that, nobody cares anymore. Well, I knew that was wrong. George, you know that's wrong. And sure enough, it was proved wrong because when they finally found a second-level publisher who published it, it ended up on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 weeks. Became a basis for Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and is still selling. Of course, you have to go ask for it. It's not just on the shelf, which is kind of an interesting thing, too. It's interesting how they highlight some things and don't highlight other things.
Well, it's on my bookshelf. I know that. I'm looking at a copy right now, along with Rule by Secrecy and Alien Agenda. I think I've got just about all of them. I guess at what point, Jim, does a publisher say, "Well, look, this guy sells now"? They at least take your phone call and are willing to print your books, right? It gets a little bit easier.
Well, that's kind of the irony of the whole thing is that I think if the big time publisher, I think if they had their druthers, they'd rather not publish me. But they haven't figured out how to explain to the secondary and tertiary level management people why they're not publishing a guy who has always made the money because his books always sell. So they grudgingly publish my book, but then they make me change the title and they cut out stuff and they stick it over on the occult shelf, or they, Rule by Secrecy. You've read that. Is there anything in there about demon worship? No. Is there anything about witches or vampires? No. So, and yet I went in several bookstores and found Rule by Secrecy on the occult shelf. So, right there with witches and vampires and all that stuff,
Tell me this: how much of you continuing to work on these kinds of topics and put yourself at considerable risk is the idea that I've got to do it because nobody else is exactly doing the same stuff you're doing?
That's interesting, and I think that's a pretty good summation, because I can recall years ago working at the newspaper. I had an editor call me, and he says, why don't you just stick to writing those fun and cute human interest stories that you do so well? And he said, why don't you lay off that Kennedy assassination and all that, things like that, And I told him way back there, and that's been, 30, 40 years ago. I said, look, I'd be perfectly happy to do that if you could show me the one reporter who's trying to deal with the real news. Okay, because, George, back in Journalism 101, I was told that news is something out of the ordinary. News is what affects the most big news. You gauge it on how many people it affects, okay? The wreck on the freeway, that's news, okay? But it doesn't really affect anybody except just the people involved. But if it's a news about bank fraud, now you're talking millions of customers. That's bigger news. But today we get the wreck on the freeway or the local shooting, and the bank fraud news is shuffled back to the back pages or to just a few, about 10 seconds at the end of the newscast, right?
Well, I have to admit that is accurate, and it drives me crazy. I mean, I work at a really good place, a really solid news station, but there are pressures in our industry, and a lot of it comes from the audience, I'm sorry to say. They don't want things that are longer or more complicated than can be explained in 90-second sound bites. They don't, and if you put stuff on that is longer and more complicated and more in-depth, they turn to channel.
Let me ask you something, George. When you were in school, high school, college, whatever, did you ever take a civics course?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, see, you must have grown up in the old republic like I did, because I took a civics course too, but today they don't offer civics anymore. And civics is simply a study of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, about how to be a good citizen. And that's why we now have a zombified national audience that would rather watch cars crash into each other or pretty girls.
Well, Jim Mars, that's where we're heading.
That's something that really counts.
That's where we're heading. Jim Mars, let's start with the big picture. Share with us sort of the view through this prism through which you look at the world. I mean, once you see these connections, New World Order, Nazis, 9/11, alien agenda, all that stuff, seemingly disparate topics, unrelated. Once you see the connections, though, there's no going back. You can't unsee it. Is that how it is for you?
Well, that's exactly right. And once you see it, then once you understand it, then you start seeing more and more and more. And when something happens and there's an immediate reaction, and let's say some terrible event, and then within an hour they've named somebody who isn't even around and said, well, he's responsible. but we had no idea this was going to happen. I mean, that doesn't even make any sense. Come on, unless somebody left a calling card behind. So you start putting things together. But I mean, just put it this way: there's two schools of thought about events and about human history, and one is the stuff happens. Oh well, got a few bad apples. Otherwise, we're just all muddling along, and things happen. The accidental view of history, and the other view, of course, is the conspiratorial view of history. And like Franklin Roosevelt said about politics, he said in politics, if something happens, he said in politics, nothing just happens. If something happens, you better believe it was planned that way. Well, that's the way it is throughout life. That's the way it is throughout our society. That's the way it is throughout the world. You go back and you find every major event in the world, riots, revolutions, wars, et cetera. It all comes back. Somebody started it. Somebody did something. Somebody had a plan, and they're working a plan. Let me put it this way, George. If you were a businessman, you have a business. And I say, George, what's your business plan? And you say, oh, I don't have one. Well, people would consider you kind of an idiot, right? Mm-hmm. But yet if I said, well, George, tell me your business plan. No, wait a minute, that's proprietary. I don't think I'm going to tell you that. Oops, that's a conspiracy, isn't it? You and your employees and your CEOs, your administrative staff, you got a plan, but you're not going to tell your competition about it. You're not going to tell everybody about it. That's a conspiracy. So a conspiracy is neither good nor bad. It's how you use it. In fact, let me put it this way. I think you'd agree with me, George, that we have the off-the-shelf technology right here, right now, to feed, clothe, house, and give basic medical treatment to every living soul on this planet, right? We have
I do agree with that,
don't we?
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Okay. Now, but it's not that way, okay? Because even as we're talking, even as people are listening here to Coast, we somehow in the back of our mind know that there are thousands, perhaps millions of children starving to death right now. But why is that? I don't want that. You don't want that. I've been to say that none of your audience members want that. So why is it that way? Because somewhere somebody wants it that way. If nobody wanted it that way, it wouldn't be that way, would it? Now, to me, that is the biggest proof not only of conspiracy, but the biggest conspiracy going on right now.
I don't know if you heard my introduction in the first couple of minutes there, but I mentioned that I'm no longer an optimist on a way out of the mess we're in. I mean, and specifically regarding Wall Street, we're going to talk about that for a while now. This Wall Street, the stranglehold these guys have on politics, it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican, they own both of them. They own Congress, they own the White House, and you can't get there and can't get into power unless they own you. And even if you're not owned by the time you get there, you'll be owned soon enough. And I'm really discouraged by the whole thing, and I don't know if you are or not.
Well, I get down now and then, but I try to keep a positive attitude about everything because, for one thing, there's more of us than there are of them. This whole thing about the 1%, the 99% is basically very true. And we're not, and let's make some distinctions here. We're not just talking about rich people with a lot of money. A lot of sports figures have a lot of money. A lot of Hollywood movie stars have a lot of money, but they're not trying to control the world. We're talking about a very, very small handful of people connected to blue bloodline families that go all the way back through history. Even some of them even claim relationships all the way back to the ancient gods. Okay, and these people think they have a right to run the world, and they're entitled to their opinion, but I happen to be of a different opinion, and I think most other people would too. And when the main thing is, let's look at the fruits of their labor. Same thing. Well, let's put down the Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve System was put into place through a conspiracy. The people involved called it a conspiracy. And they slipped it in as law during a Christmas holiday back in 1913. And now we have private bankers running our financial system in this country. It was something that was fought against all the way back to the framing of the Constitution, when they were arguing we do not need a central bank. And then they slipped one in, and it turned out to be corrupt, caused problems, so they threw it out, got another one. It was corrupt, they threw it out. Finally, when Andrew Jackson came along in the early 1830s, he said, that's it, you're a den of vipers. And they shut him down, said no central bank, and America prospered from then on until the bankers created some scandals and some runs and some fear back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then finally sneaked through this conspiratorial banking bill that was supposed to be a corrective measure. It was supposed to regulate the banks, but what it did was put the banks in charge. Now, their whole avowed purpose, and it's still there, you can go look at their website, is to prevent recessions and prevent depressions and to have the flow of money equalized, and so that we all are equal participants and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, has that worked? No. We've had 2 world wars, a Great Depression, ongoing, unending warfare, the rise of the police state, the rise of the surveillance state, so they really hadn't even done their job. And yet when you start talking about trying to just audit them, just to find out where his money's going, like Ron Paul tried to do, you get blocked. And then when they haul Ben Bernanke up, the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and ask him about that $15 trillion of U.S. tax money that was sent overseas, and his first response was, no, I don't have to tell you that. What? That's my money? And you're not even going to tell me what you did with it? Folks, we're in just some deep doo-doo here, and nobody seems to care. And that's why, George, my book, The $1 Trillion Conspiracy, which is how exciting is that, the $1 trillion conspiracy?
It actually should probably be a $5 trillion or $15 trillion conspiracy.
That's true. Actually, it's more than that. But it sounds like a book you'd find on the financial bookshelf, which is exactly where they put it in several bookstores. And yet, my original title was Zombie Nation, because we are being turned into a nation of zombies, and I use the term advisedly because, George, you've kept up with this. You mentioned earlier, I would disagree with you. We're not talking about zombie bankers. We're talking about zombie banks.
Right.
Okay. And I know that was a slip of your tongue. But consider this, and that's where I got the name from, because these banks that are bankrupt, okay, they've overextended themselves. They've gotten tangled up in that derivatives market. Their toxic debts outweigh their assets. They are broke. They're dead, okay? But we've bailed them out with taxpayer money, our hard-earned money, and so they're still going through the motions of business. They're still alive there, and so they've been called, rightly so, a zombie bank. They're dead, but they're still going through the motions. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's look at us. Let's look at our country. As you say, depending on who you want to listen to, we owe minimum $15 trillion, perhaps as much as $20, $30 trillion, perhaps even more, okay? And yet, it's been estimated that if every man, woman, and child in this country sold off all their assets, their clothes, their TV, their car, their house, and everything else, we wouldn't come up with but about $9 or $10 trillion, which means as a country, we're broke and we're dead, but we're just going through the motions. We are a zombie nation.
I wasn't prepared to jump into the Fed right now, but since you brought it up, we might as well get right to it. You're in the book, you mentioned about how Ron Paul has tried to do something fairly simple that should be fairly reasonable. Let's have an audit of the Fed.
Right.
And yet, it's not going to happen, is it?
No, it's not. Here's what kills me about Ron Paul. He's the only one talking sense. Everybody I talk to says, well, I like what he says, but I can't vote for him because he's unelectable. And I say, well, wait a minute. Did you just wake up some morning and decide that? Do you know him? Do you know something I don't know? I said, or is that something the media, the corporate media, has drummed into you? Okay? Because if everybody who says, well, I like what Ron Paul says, but I can't vote for him because he's unelectable, if they'd actually vote for him, he might win. But, in fact, look what he's done now. Because he said, look, I don't have billions and billions of dollars from the large corporations, special interests, so I'm not going to go campaign in these other states. Number one, he's already got. I believe he's possibly got enough delegates to break the Republican National Convention into an open convention. Maybe not, but of course the media portrays it like, oh, he's dropped out. He hadn't dropped out. And dropped out at all. And see, that's not good media. That's not journalism. That's not telling the truth. It's absolutely amazing. But here's what gets me. George, picture yourself as the head of the Republican National Committee. Okay? Now your job is you want a presidential candidate there that's going to take on Obama and has a really good chance of winning because he offers a clear alternative, okay? You also want a candidate who can raise a lot of money because that's what the party politics is really all about, as you well know. Okay, so let's look who we got here. Well, most of them have already fallen by the wayside, thank goodness. But you got one candidate still hanging in there as a Republican candidate who has raised more money than Romney and Santorum and Newt Gingrich and all the rest of them put together. And you've got a candidate who has the largest support base from the rank-and-file members of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Who's that? Ron Paul. And yet, according to the corporate mass media, why, he doesn't count. Never mind. Oh, he's scary. He's scary. Yeah, he's scary. He talks about maybe ending these wars, you know. He's not talking about cutting defense. He's not talking about not defending the country. He's just talking about getting us out of some of these wars all around the place, like Afghanistan. And here's what I don't get about Afghanistan, George. Why are we still in Afghanistan? We went in there to get bin Laden, but we didn't get him, you know, supposedly until last year. And then he was in Pakistan. So why are we in Afghanistan? Well, now we're told, well, we can't just pull out of Afghanistan because until we train their army and their police forces to maintain security in the country. Well, wait a minute. I've been reading the news, and ever since first year, I've seen story after story about the Afghan army and police forces shooting at our guys. So wait a minute. So we got to stay in a country to train their army and police so they can shoot and kill our people? It doesn't make any sense at all, does it?
Sort of reminds you of Vietnam, doesn't it, at some point,
really
where we were there just to sell helicopters and stuff?
Yeah. And the never-to-be-forgotten comment of an officer over in Vietnam, he said, well, in order to save that village, we had to destroy it.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah. Some of the stuff that you explored in Crossfire that made it into the movie JFK, and it's one of the things I wanted to get to that you discussed earlier in this $1 Trillion Conspiracy book, in which you talk about the consequences for people like Ron Paul who dare to take this kind of thing on. Andrew Jackson, who challenged the big bankers early on, was, I think, as you note, one of the first American president to be targeted for assassination.
That's right. And I tell you what, I don't think it's just sheer coincidence that the only two American presidents who've tried to issue interest-free money, in other words, money that is not controlled and having interest paid to the international bankers, was Abraham Lincoln, who issued greenbacks to support the war between the states, and John F. Kennedy, who in June of 1963 issued $4.2 billion in United States notes. Okay, and I don't think it's a coincidence that both those two presidents were shot in the head in public.
You think this Fed and the monetary policy is what got JFK killed, or he had a couple of reasons to get rid of him?
I think he had multiple reasons, but I think that's the one. Once those international bankers said, hey, we got to do something about this situation, then others' hands were untied.
The other point you make in this is that those candidates who look like, hey, this guy might get into power, we got to do something about him, they find ways to derail a candidacy. For example, third-party candidates. You make that point.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, see, that's how the Federal Reserve got in the first place, was Howard Taft, who was president at the time, had already said he was against the Federal Reserve System plan, this law, and that it was nothing but a law to help the bankers, and he pledged that he would never sign that bill. Well, he's running for re-election in 1912. So once they realized he was going to be a problem and that he had overwhelming support from the public, they went, they, meaning these financial powers, went and talked with Theodore Roosevelt into running on a third party as the Bull Moose candidate. Well, it split the ticket, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who was already closely tied to the New York bankers, Wall Street bankers, he gets in and he signs the Federal Reserve Act. Again, and this has happened time and time again. In 2006, I believe it was, here in Texas, about 75% of the Texas voters voted against Rick Perry. But because the ticket was so split between the Republican and then Kinky Friedman, the musician, Grandma Strayhorn, who just happened to be the mother of Scott McClellan, Bush's White House press secretary. I know she was a ringer. And the Libertarian, he gets in again. Perry gets in again and is still governor, even though 75% of the voters didn't want him.
I was really surprised to learn, well, I guess maybe not, that you can file a FOIA request, supposedly the Freedom of Information Act with law of the land that should apply with some exceptions to all government agencies. Doesn't apply to the Fed because, like most Americans, I'm a little confused about exactly how the heck this thing is put together. It controls our monetary policy, but it's not a public agency.
That's right. It's neither federal nor does it have any reserves. They just print money, and then when they get our money on the bailouts, that $15 trillion that I mentioned, which early on they refused to tell us what happened to it, but I think a couple of courageous congressmen and some Freedom of Information Acts finally wormed a little out of them. And it turns out that $15 trillion went to foreign banks to prop up foreign banks. Wait a minute. And I'm like everybody else. I get gouged at tax time, but I keep trying to tell myself, well, it's going for roads and schools, and we got to support our military, and we got to do all this good stuff. But nobody ever told me that I was paying my hard-earned money to send overseas to foreign countries banks to prop them up from bad business decisions. We're just zombies. We're zombies. We're just stumbling around, and we have no idea what's really going on.
You had to submit Crossfire to 25 publishers before one would put it out, even though everyone said, man, it was a great book. It's factual. It's well-researched and documented. 25 publishers passed on it. I guess looking back, you're not surprised now with the broader framework that you have that so many wouldn't even touch it.
That's true. As you yourself well know, there is incredible control over the corporate mass media. And that's a tragic thing because no one can be considered really free if they don't have free access to all of the information. The same way that you can be the most brilliant person in the whole world, but if you're operating on incomplete or erroneous information, you'll never be able to make a correct decision on anything. We know today that there's like 5 major corporations, multinational corporations, with interlocking directorships and interlocking ownerships that control everything we see and hear.
What we're going to use for tonight's discussion is your book. It's called Our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? And we'll get into specifics in a moment. But in general, for you, you went down a rabbit hole when you wrote Crossfire. That was pretty wild for you to challenge the conventional view of the JFK assassination. but it's nothing compared to where you've gone now. I mean, you had no idea where this would lead. The threads of that conspiracy that led to something so much bigger and more sinister.
Well, George, it's interesting that you're talking to me about that because from what I know, you've gone down that same rabbit hole.
That's right. But from a different thread, from a different thread. It ends up at the same place, though, doesn't it?
Well, if you don't start off with a preconceived idea like the government has in most of its investigations, and you start following the evidence, then you end up at the same place. But, this might interest you because I'm holding in my hand here a very yellowed copy of my old newspaper I used to work for, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which is a major metropolitan newspaper. And the top headline on the front page says, "Panel may face possibility of coup in JFK's slaying." And the first lead says, "The new House Committee on Assassinations may find itself faced with the distinct possibility that a coup d'etat occurred in 1963 with the complicity of U.S. government officials." And a little later down in there, and this is interesting too, because a lot of people think that it's only recently that we've decided that there's something other than a lone assassin. But it says even before 1970, national polls reported as many as 80% of the public disbelieved the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald not acted alone. Now, George, this story was written and published in the Star-Telegram on December the 1st, 1976. Okay? So this is nothing new, folks. The information has been there all along. It simply has not been presented to the public in a comprehensive and repetitive way.
In your book, you mentioned about JFK, and, in several books you've mentioned about the conspiracy, and we'll get into some specifics in a moment. But in the larger picture, in this Our Occulted History, you mentioned about how some of this stuff has been reported. You've reported it. Others have reported it.
Right.
And it seems to get us nowhere. I mean, is it disconcerting and disappointing to you on some level that it can't seem to quite break through?
I've been at this for about almost 50 years now, so I've kind of gotten inured a little bit to it. I realize that most people are they have their hands full trying to take care of their life and their family and their job, and this is why my big complaint is with the so-called news media. This is where the public turns because when they want to know what's going on. They're too busy with their lives. They can't, so they turn on the TV, they turn on the radio, they pick up their newspaper because they want to find out what's going on, and they're not being told.
You don't feel hopeless, do you?
No, not at all. In fact, I feel vindicated. Here we are 51 years after the Kennedy assassination, and I've been trying to tell people all along there was a conspiracy, and today the vast majority of people, according to national polls, do understand and accept that there was a conspiracy. What you have, though, is this dichotomy of the masses of the public understanding that there was something going on, but the opinion leaders, the politicians, and the federal government and the mass corporate media, they're trying to tell us something completely different. This is nothing new. We can go back and start talking all the way back to Pearl Harbor, which most everybody today is taught in school and still believes was this surprise attack by the Japanese on our base in Hawaii. But what is now understood by serious historians is that certain people in the United States, high in the government, and yes, we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt and his chief of staff, General George Marshall, they knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. And they allowed it to happen because it satisfied their political goal of getting an aroused, angered, and united American public into the war.
This book, I was wondering when I saw the title, it's been out for about a year now, but Our Occulted History, I was wondering to myself, where's Jim Marrs going with this? Witchcraft, sorcery, or what? But you point out early on that the word occult isn't really something about the supernatural at all.
No, it's not. I use the term in the astronomical sense. When the moon eclipses the sun, that's called an occultation. It occults the sun. It hides or masked the sun. And so basically this is about hidden history, about history that goes all the way back, and it's pretty astounding. And George, again, this is great that you and I, because you've been wrestling with the extraterrestrial situation for a good number of years now, and I think probably you would agree with me that it's really astounding when you go back and look through history to find that the whole history of humankind is just rife with stories of beings that fly through the air, that come from other worlds, that have brought us knowledge, that have brought us technology, brought us farming, law, language. It's just there if you want to look at it.
And in a bad way too. You start off the book with references to two things that I'm familiar with. Charles Fort, who wrote in this thing called the Book of the Damned, a statement that we've heard before, that he thought, after studying all kinds of paranormal weird stuff, that we are, quote, property of some other intelligence. And then you also make a reference to a guy, William Bramley, who wrote a book in 1990 called The Gods of Eden. Came out of nowhere, but he had covered some of the same territory, and then he left. He left the scene and didn't write about it anymore, suggesting that there is an inherent relationship between war in human history and strife and death and some kind of other intelligence. So why don't we start it there? I mean, you picked up, you cast a pretty wide net in suggesting that there has been interaction with some other intelligence for a very long time.
Well, that's true. And the thing is, this is nothing new. What I do in my book, Our Occulted History, and go back and show that there is compelling evidence, sometimes almost overwhelming, that this planet and perhaps our entire solar system has been visited in the far distant past by non-human intelligences. One of the key tip-offs of all this is the fact that we're well aware of the mystery of the pyramids in Egypt. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, for example, show very definite evidence of heavy water erosion, which means they sat out under rains for a long time, and heavy rains. And yet the geologists will tell you that there has not been significant rainfall on the Giza Plateau for more than 10,000 years, which means the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, at least, were probably in existence thousands of years before the Egyptians ever came along. Well, then who built them? And then you begin to broaden your view, and you find out that it's not just Egypt that has pyramids. We've got pyramids in South America and in Central America and in the Mississippi River Valley and in China and in Bosnia and under the Caribbean and in Russia. Holy cow, there's pyramids everywhere. And then we find out there's pyramids on the moon. And there's pyramids that are startlingly similar configuration to those on the Giza Plateau on the planet Mars. So wait a minute, what's going on here? Has there been a super technological civilization that had interplanetary flight long before our recorded history? And this seems to be the case, particularly when you start throwing in all of the ancient legends and stories, such as the ancient civilizations of Mu or Atlantis. It's just there. It's just there. Not to mention all of the anomalies and artifacts that we find all around the world. I love that term, anomalies. That's the WTF of the science world. What is it? We don't know. So we'll call it an anomaly.
Well, I said when we started that you cast a very wide net, and it's even bigger than that. You start talking about the origins of the solar system, the origins of the moon, and there's some stuff in there I don't think I've ever read before. I don't remember seeing before that the moon is a billion years older than the Earth, which casts all kinds of doubt on what we've always heard about how the moon formed.
That's true. And in fact, I'd ask everyone to just stop and consider this. See, when I was a kid in school, we were told that the moon broke away from the Earth.
Right.
But now that we've been there, we know that the composition of moon rocks is not in any way similar to the composition of rocks on Earth. And as you said, some of the rocks found on the moon predate the Earth. So it came from somewhere else. So picture the Earth hanging in space. Here comes the moon from somewhere, and it's sailing along. It goes past the Earth, gets caught in the Earth's gravitational field, and it's pulled back. And that goes on for, thousands of years until it finally gets into orbit around the Earth. Well, then, okay, but it should be in an elongated elliptical orbit, probably wobbling around, especially since we know that the center of gravity in the moon is not in the center. It's about 2 miles off center. Now, if you take a ball and the inner core is off center and you try to roll it along the floor, it's just going to wobble all around.
But there are other facts in the book that I found equally disturbing, and one of them deals with a lunar module that slammed into the moon. And Jim, I don't recall ever reading this before about what happened as a result of that.
Well, it was in the mainstream media. It's one of the landers, the booster. They let it go, and it dropped back onto the moon. And according to NASA officials, the moon rang and reverberated like a bell for like 6 or 7 hours, which, would tend to indicate that it was a hollow object. But, of course, as science tells us, a natural object cannot be a hollow object. So it's interesting because at one point I had occasion to interview Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And I asked him, I said, what do you think about the theory that the moon is hollow? And he kind of laughed and said, oh, no, the moon's not hollow. But then he went on to say, of course, we do speculate because we know that the heavier materials are on the outside, that there may be giant caverns in the moon. Well, here's a famous hero astronaut. I don't want to get in his face, but I'm thinking, hey, giant caverns of the moon, hollow moon, what's the difference? But the other key thing that I was getting to was if the moon came along and was captured by the Earth, then it should be in a wobbly, erratic, elliptical orbit and kind of wobbling around the Earth. But that's not the case. The moon is in a perfect near-circular orbit right around the equator and stationary, with one side always facing the Earth. And even the famous scientist Isaac Asimov said the moon shouldn't be where it is. But, George, this leads us to the great dichotomy of our thinking, you see, because we know the moon's been there as long as human written history is there, because people have all written and talked about the moon. And we also know there's no such things as aliens, and yet it seems that it's been parked there. It was parked in this particular and peculiar orbit, particularly since it's at the exact distance away from the Earth that when it eclipses the sun, it just totally covers the corona of the sun. It's just at that perfect distance and stationary and in a near-perfect circular orbit. So it had to, the only explanation for being where it is it was parked there. But we know there's no aliens, and we know we didn't do it. So let's just not talk about it. We won't talk about that.
The Coast to Coast has these shows on from time to time about anomalies on the moon and on Mars. And I sort of just agreed that I'm going to put that aside because it's too much for me. I've seen some of the photos, and I think people tell me, oh, yeah, there's a skyscraper. And I look at the photos, and I think, well, it looks like a dirt clod to me. But you mentioned a couple of examples in this book that I was unfamiliar with about structures on the moon that sure as heck sound like they were made by somebody.
That's right. Well, there's one particular point that juts off the surface of the moon for almost a mile up that's called the Shard, and it's in NASA photographs, and yet nobody has any explanation for what it is. I've also seen, now, I'm kind of with you, George. I've seen so many, there's a lot of stuff out on the internet that says, oh, look, here's a Coke bottle on the moon. Oh, yeah. Look, here's a human skull. Here's Bigfoot on Mars or whatever. So there's a lot of junk out there. And most of it's kind of blurry little something. And it's kind of like, counting elephants in the clouds or something. But, But there are others that are really, truly amazing. Some NASA photographs that show tracks on the moon. One particular I'm thinking of that shows what looks like tank treads almost coming down off the side of a crater and moving out onto the flat plain with some kind of round object there, and of course my first thought was that, well, this, is a round type rock, and it somehow came loose and it rolled down the side of the crater, rolled out on the plain. And yet in the original photograph, you can actually see that these tracks come up the inside of the crater. And of course, we all know nothing rolls up. That's just a natural object. So, and then you add to that the fact that lights have been seen moving on the moon. There was a water spray that swept across the moon, and structures. In the 50s, it was reported that they saw a bridge-type artifact traversing one of the craters, and this was seen by other astronomers for weeks, and then all of a sudden it wasn't there anymore. Something is going on.
As part of casting your wide net, not only what we know about the solar system and the formation of the moon and things like that are wrong, but you suggest that what we know about humanity itself is wrong, that evolution, there are some pretty serious problems with the theory of evolution. And before all the intelligent design people start whooping and hollering, you got to be careful what you wish for, because the intelligent designer may not be God.
Or not the God as we picture.
Yeah. You make the point, though, that you start with a discussion about the Smithsonian. The idea that could our understanding of human history and earlier civilizations be totally distorted? Could you conceal something like that? And the Smithsonian, if they haven't, they sure have made a good attempt at it.
That's exactly right, and I point that out in my book. Man, what most people don't understand about the Smithsonian is that, yes, we do view that as this premier scientific institution, which is true. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the Smithsonian Institute is a branch of the federal government. It's owned by the government. And so, therefore, unfortunately, so many artifacts, anomalies, strange things have disappeared into the Smithsonian, never to be heard of again. One example is a newspaper article from 1909 that goes into great detail about how that they found these caves in the north end of the Grand Canyon with Egyptian artifacts in them. And it gives a very detailed description, and it says all of this was turned over to the Smithsonian. But the Smithsonian today disclaims any of this, says, no, that never happened. And yet, what puzzles me is that, sure enough, on the north side of the Grand Canyon, especially around the area around 94 Mile Creek and Trinity Creek, we find formations in areas that have been named the Tower of Set and the Tower of Ra and the Horus Temple, and the Temple of Isis and Osiris. Well, where did those names come from if there wasn't some tie and connection to the Egyptians?
Explain you have another example that's more recent, that's from 1999. National Park Service in Arizona, in this canyon, there's a big washout, torrential rains that uncover a bunch of really strange skeletons. And Park Service employees all go out there. They're pressed into service to gather them up, put them in boxes, and they go to the Smithsonian, and it's overseen by the FBI. Now, what's the deal on that?
What is the deal on that? And you go try to ask them about it, and they say, oh, that never happened. This is what I'm talking about in our hidden history, our occulted history. But now, if you really want to get weird about it, I would like to tell you about sidereal time.
Okay.
What is sidereal time? Well, we use the common meridian time, which is based on the rotation of the Earth around the sun. And we gauge that in 24-hour segments. And this is what we use. It also causes problems because, like, you're in Las Vegas, and so, you're in a different time zone than I am. Causes us some problems. So sidereal time is used by astronomers and astrophysicists, NASA, as well as the ancient seamen and this is gauging time by the movement of the stars. And, of course, the stars do move, but ever so slowly to our perception. So this is called sidereal time. And sidereal time is also broken into 24-hour sections. Okay, fine. So you're with me to that. So what's the big deal? Okay, the big deal is that, let's go back to the Kennedys. You got Joseph Kennedy Jr., who was killed in a mysterious plane explosion piloting a super secret craft in World War II, and he died in 1944. John F. Kennedy, of course, was killed in November 1963 in Dallas. What is largely not understood was that Ted Kennedy almost lost his life in a plane crash in mid-1964. Robert Kennedy, of course, was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968, and John F. Kennedy Jr. died in a plane crash in 1999, just as he had let some people know that he was going to run for senator of New York. Okay, well, you would think that that's just terrible, and in fact it's been termed the Kennedy curse, but what nobody understands and what to me strikes me as being so weird is that all of those Kennedy brothers' deaths occurred within the same sidereal hour, the 16th hour. It's pretty amazing. That would be like saying that they all died between noon and 1 o'clock on the same day. Now, that to have a series of these 6 events all in the same hour that has been computed to be 191 million times, not possible. It would be the same as rolling 24-sided dice 6 times in a row and having a consistent outcome of the number 16. It's really just amazing. So what this tells us is that, in fact, the National Optical Astronomy Observatory said that all these evidence fall within the same hour of the local sidereal time. Now, that's really not possible unless this was all part of some weird cosmic plan. And to add to that mystery and to add to that seemingly occult situation is it's true that the important space missions by NASA, particularly the Apollo missions, the date and time of the launches, it turns out, were not established by any scientific criteria, but by astrological alignment of the planets. Now, whether you want to believe in that or not is not material. But the point is that somebody with enough power to set the date and time of Apollo space shots did believe in this occultism.
Wow.
Yeah,
I want to come back to the Kennedy curse because but before we leave the bigger picture of who is responsible for this, because I'll tell you, frankly, if there's a global elite, I would think the Kennedys would be part of it. But we'll come back to that. Before we leave the bigger picture, you write extensively about ancient civilizations, in particular the Sumerians, who gave us so much of what we consider to be the bedrocks of civilization. They and other ancient civilizations, pretty much all of them, wrote the same kind of accounts of these interactions with gods from the sky, ancient beings, traveling in spaceships. All of those civilizations had the same basic story, and we discount all of it as sort of quaint, provincial, dumb, not accurate.
Well, that's because when these ancient civilizations were first beginning to be studied in a scientific matter, that takes us back into the early to mid 1800s. Those people, even the most scientific of them at that time, had no inkling of atoms. They didn't even know about penicillin. They didn't know about germs. They certainly didn't know about spacecraft. They didn't even think it was possible for heavier than air flight. And so when they read these accounts of these ancient people, from the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, all accounts through history about beings who came down from the sky, were able to fly through the air, and gave us knowledge, then they just wrote that off as mythology. Oh, well, these were their gods. This is who they worship. What's really fascinating and revealing is when you go back and actually study the stories themselves, many of those ancient peoples and civilizations did not refer to them as gods. They just referred to them as individuals. For example, the ancient Sumerian tablets that are still in existence, because unlike paper and papyrus that can burn up and be destroyed or deteriorate, these were etched in stone or in mud and then baked into stone, and they still exist. And they simply said the Anunnaki, and that's been translated as those who came from the heavens and landed on the earth. And so it was only later interpretation, not translation, that suddenly transformed these beings into ancient gods. For example, if you want to read the story of the Anunnaki, it's all in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But you have to look under Sumerian mythology, because that's where they placed them, and that's where most people have relegated these stories. But once you begin to take a different interpretation, not translation, just the interpretation, and you go, wait a minute, maybe they're telling us about real beings and about real people or real entities, okay? And this is what I try to tell people is that when you have the opportunity, you need to start considering that some of these stories may actually be true. I mean, this may be what they're trying to tell us. For example, when you look at the so-called mythology, and you begin to see that although the names change due to language is changing, you find the same individuals and the same personalities. For example, the Sumerians said there was one Anunnaki who was in the sky, the patriarch of these Anunnaki, and his name was Anu. Well, in the Egyptian mythology, we find it's Amun-Ra. In the Greek, it's Kronos, and in the Roman, it's Saturn. And then there was the Lord over the earth, which in the Sumerian was Enlil, in the Egyptian is Set, the Greek is Zeus, Roman is Jupiter. Same thing with the goddess of love. In the Sumerian was Astaroth, in Egyptian Hathor, in Greek Aphrodite, and in Roman Venus. And we keep thinking of these as totally separate civilizations, and yet what we find is that they can all be traced back. They all are a de-evolution of the Sumerian civilization that devolved into the Babylonian, the Syrian, and then into the Egyptian, and then into the Greek, and then the Roman. And so we find that perhaps they're actually talking about the same entities, the same intelligent beings. It's just that the names change as the language is changed.
I thought one of the most persuasive and interesting parts of the book are about anthropologists, modern anthropology, sociologists, the folks who presumably would want to figure out this stuff, and how willing they are to suppress anything that goes against the grain. I mean, you got some pretty good examples.
Yeah, that's very true. But, never underestimate the power of the status quo. When you have someone who has built a reputation and published some books and maybe has a tenured professorship all based on Egyptology, then they are loath to admit that maybe they were totally wrong about it all.